Okay, let's get started here. I am very pleased to introduce to you today Jesse Kadekawa. If I transpose two letters.
It's okay.
Kadekawa Miguel, who is a bridge architect. He is the senior bridge architect and national bridge practice leader in bridge architecture for HNTB. He has a BA from Washington University in St. Louis, Masters of Architecture from MIT, and he has over 40 years of professional experience, having worked on several bridges and transportation nationwide with the emphasis on aesthetics. Jesse has presented at the Transportation Review Board.
Research Board.
Visualization in Transportation Symposiums, the International Bridge Conferences, and presented at universities on HNTB projects. Notable bridge projects include the Leonard P. Zakim Bunker Hill Memorial Bridge in Boston, Tilikum Crossing in Portland, Oregon, Broadway Bridge in Little Rock, Greenville Bridge in Greenville, Mississippi, Stan Musial Veterans Memorial Bridge in St. Louis, the George Voinovich I-90 Inner Belt Bridge in Cleveland, the Walk Bridge in Norwalk, Connecticut, and I'm going to call it the K Bridge in New York. I'm going to turn it over to Jesse.
Thank you. Again, thank you for inviting me on this. And what a great introduction. So again, my name is Jesse Kadekawa Miguel. And so this will be the agenda that I'll be talking about, but a little bit about myself. As she mentioned that I went to Washington University and MIT. I was born in Okinawa, Japan. I moved here in the U.S. when I was 11. My father was an architect, and I kind of followed his footsteps because he was a civil servant for the armed forces on the bases in Okinawa after the war. And so he worked directly with the civil engineers at that time. And so I think when I went to WashU, I said I didn't want to be an architect because he didn't seem to be making a lot of money. My uncle, who he and his wife, who was my aunt, sponsored us to come to the U.S. and he was again a surgeon, and so he, was doing really well. So I thought, okay, I'll be I want to become a doctor, even though I'm not good at sciences. So first semester at WashU, I realized that I don't like the sciences. Then I saw some of the fellow architects who couldn't draw freehand, and that's something that I did all, my whole childhood or so. And so I decided to switch to architecture, and my father laughed because he said, I knew you would, and he had all these supplies that he saved for years for me to use. And the interesting thing is, again, I started out at HNTB after MIT, that I worked on buildings, which is what an architect typically does. Works on buildings, and I worked on airports, convention centers. But then I was asked to come to Kansas City because I got into something called computer animation. Okay, way back when, again, when I started, everybody was drawing on the, on drafting tables, on boards, and then computers came into play, and I started kind of fiddling around with doing 3D animation, creating 3D models, and then I was asked to come to Kansas City in their headquarters to head up the computer animation group. And so that's what I did in '95, and so I've been here in Kansas City almost 30 years. But I thought at that time I would be doing more buildings. Now, most people know who HNTB is, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. and when you think of HNTB, well, okay, what do you think of? Buildings or arenas or?
To be honest, I don't.
Okay. All right. So, so basically, HNTB is well known for sports architecture. And I'll tell you a little bit of history about that. But if you're a fan of the 49ers, they did their stadium called Levi Stadium. If you're a fan of the Denver Broncos, we did a Bronco Stadium. And then we have also designed Las Vegas Raiders Stadium, and currently we are doing what was the Oakland A's ballpark or so. So that's where it gets more of the glamour, but then the bridges, which is what I'm going to talk about, that HNTB started out as a bridge firm over 110 years ago. And so it has diversified over the years. And so there is a rich history of bridges and how that firm started out. So I'm going to talk more about, this is the agenda that I'm going to try to follow, and I may kind of wander off, and if I do, let me know. So HNTB started out, again, as a bridge practice, and the roots of our practice was this bridge engineer named John Alexander Low Waddell. And he was originally from Canada. He was educated at, in the US, and then he worked as a draftsman for the Canadian Pacific Railroad. But the main thing is that he practiced and was also a professor of civil engineer in Japan. But then he opened up a practice in Kansas City in 1886. And then, he started in 1886, and then 1892 is when he started doing more bridges. So almost all the bridges that's over the Missouri River at that time was Waddell's influence. So one of the famous bridges that he did during that time in 1893 was this South Halsted Bridge in Chicago, Illinois. Again, most bridges at that time were railroad bridges. Again, cars were not invented yet, so the railroad is what kind of drove the building of a lot of the bridges in the U.S. And again, Waddell, when he was starting his practice, of course, he needed partners when it started growing. So one of his first partners was a gentleman named Ira Hedrick that in 1899. And then 1901, Ernest Howard, which is the H of HNTB that I'll explain later on. And this gentleman named Lewis Ash joined the firm, and then Ira Hedrick left. And then John Harrington, 1907, joined the firm. And he's another name that is also well known in Kansas City. So this is John Harrington. So the firm was called Waddell and Harrington for the longest time. So, and they did several bridges. This one here is Arroyo Seco Viaduct. Now it's called the Colorado Street Bridge. And this bridge in Pasadena is still standing. It's been featured on several movies. I think the recent one was in La La Land, that I think they were the ones kind of walking along the bridge. So, and then here in Kansas City is the ASB Bridge. That's the one that was opened in 1912, and ASB stands for Armored Swift Burlington. And most people may know, if you're old enough and you live in the area, that this used to be a double-decker bridge, that it served vehicles on one deck and the railroad on the other. And so that they had it so that you had the railroad be on one area, and then the roadway bridge was on another deck. And it was like that for the longest time until they built the Heart of America Bridge, which then they ended up taking down that bridge. They also did this in Cleveland, and this is, it was called the Detroit Superior Bridge. That was in 1917, and currently it's been renamed the Veterans Memorial Bridge. And I will sort of say that later on, I will talk about some of the restoration work that we've done to keep it going. And so again, that was, it started in 1910. And then Lewis Ash was another engineer that left and came back and worked. And then in 1914, there was a split. You've got two engineers who have very strong personalities and egos, and at some point, I think there is going to be a rift or so, and so that's kind of what happened. That Waddell ended up leading the firm. That he ended up forming a partnership with his son Needham, and he also had a gentleman named Hardesty, who was also worked there. And then he ended up moving to New York. And so today that firm is now called Hardesty in Hanover, that they are also a very premier bridge engineering firm that's based out of New York. And then Harrington ended up forming a firm called Harrington, Howard, and Ash. So that was the name, and they said that the original start of that firm is at 1914. So Ernest Howard and Lewis Ash was made partners at that time. And then the bridge there is called the Steel Bridge. That was in Portland, Oregon. And we had the date of 1914, and apparently both HNTB and Hardesty will claim that that's their bridge. And so there is a little bit of a battle, but then in both websites it will kind of mention that, because even though Waddell wasn't with that firm anymore, that was designed at that time. And then later on, 1917, Enoch Needles joined the firm. Later on, Reuben Bergendorf joined the firm. And then at some point again, Harrington also got into a disagreement with all the new partners that he had. So he ended up leaving. So he ended up forming a firm called Harrington and Cordeloo that from 1928 to 2000, it operated as primarily a bridge firm, but it never got that big. That they just mostly, I'll say, local bridges or so, but in the end, they were acquired by Burns and McDonnell. So now Burns and McDonnell and have a bridge division that was part of Harrington and Cordeloo. And then the remaining firm was called Ash, Howard, Needles, and Tamman. So again, Tamman was made partner, and then 1929, the stock market crashed. And so you're talking about one of the partners, Bergendorf, it's like he had to leave. He was laid off because there was a lack of work. And this bridge in Vicksburg Bridge, again, we started doing a lot of bridges over the Mississippi River. And the main partner, Ash, ended up dying prior to the opening of that bridge because he was kind of stubborn that he wanted to check certain things when they were building the piers. And so he ended up suffering the bends from going down deep with that same issue. And it was something that, again, when you start building bridges, that's something you've always encountered at that time, and people didn't know about it. So HNTB, the name stayed as Ash, Howard, Needles, and Tamman, all the way up to 1940. And during that time, they ended up building, I'll say, very few bridges. There were still some prominent bridges that they had built. This is the Harlem River Bridge in New York. Today it's called RFK Bridge. And that is still in operation. It's a vertical lift bridge. And you'll see, why is there a lot of vertical lift bridges? And at that time, the railroads, when they put their tracks down, they didn't want to go up high. That's something that if you'll notice, a lot of the rail bridges try to stay as low as they can. They're not going to get up high. And so a lot of these were all vertical lift bridges, or they were swing bridges, so that they don't have to go up high and go over the navigational channel. So during that time, I think they kept working because of some of the small projects that they were working on during the Depression. So, and Bergendorf again later returned after selling insurance, and he was working as a temp for the Montana State Department until they started doing some work. But something that kept them going was this ERFC PWA. I think it's some of the reconstruction work that the U.S. government was trying to help out to get people to start building. And then in 1940, again, they did several bridges. This is the Natchez River bridge. And now we're going to start talking about aesthetics, because one of the things about this bridge, and again, it was a truss bridge over the Mississippi River, and Ernest Howard wanted to incorporate aesthetics into the bridge, even though some of them you was like, oh, they look like regular truss bridges. But the entrance and the gateways to like where you enter in at the toll plazas, he wanted it to look like Southern mansions, that kind of it reflected the area. And so that's something that he wanted something in there that was aesthetics. And then eventually, 50 years later, we did an addition to that bridge. So what you see there is a single bridge, and then when they needed to get a second bridge, they did a parallel structure. And this one was actually a photograph, but the bridge in the foreground is hand painted. Again, this is before Photoshop. Okay, and what they used to do back then is that they would end up taking large, photographs, and then you would have an artist that would paint directly on it. And I'll talk later on about Greg DeMond, that he was the bridge architect that I worked under, and he was very, very talented. So again, in 1940, it was still called Ash, Howard, Needles, Tamman. And then since Ash has been gone for quite a while after his accident or so. They finally named it Howard Needles Tannen Bergendorf, which is what today is called HNTB. So, and so, again, we talked about how to survive as a firm. So during that time, okay, like when World War II started, they lost a lot of staff, because they had to fight the war. So during that time, they weren't doing a lot of bridges. There were very few bridges at all. There's a bridge in Dubuque, Iowa, that they built in 1943. But during that time, to keep themselves busy, they also consulted for the U.S. Army on how to build temporary bridges for the war effort. There was a whole manual that they had shown so that anybody out there, as soldiers, can take this and try to build temporary bridges over certain creeks or so that they had to build. And then they also worked on certain plants, like where they had explosives and bomb loading facilities, anything for the war effort, just to keep them going. So, but then after the war, and that's something that they realized is that, okay, we can't just do only bridges. There isn't that many projects that's only bridges. So that's when they started thinking about diversifying. So they realized that around that time, from 45 to 55, there was an explosion of turnpikes. Again, cars are getting more popular, and roads needed to be built. So part of what they have done is that they started working on the turnpike. From 1945 to 55, that they ended up working for all these turnpike authorities throughout the country. The ones in New Jersey, Maine, Massachusetts, and also even in Kansas, that they had a turnpike authority to build these. And then, of course, President Eisenhower signed the legislation to form the interstate bridge, or the interstate highway system. And so they got into doing roads, that they decided that is something that was needed throughout the country. And so they ended up creating relationships. They started opening up offices throughout, closer to the cities that have all these highway authorities, such as in Cleveland, in 54, in Boston, and then Miami and Orlando, and then Milwaukee. Aviation, they started realizing, okay, there's a whole new field for aviation that we need to get into. So they decided to start working, trying to do aviation work. It's not something that they said automatically, oh, we're going to start doing planes, but they got to figure out a plan on how to get going on that. By doing roadways and tollways, that kind of led to runways that's needed for in aviation. So that's how they ended up working on that. And then in the end, they ended up getting into airport design as well as terminal design. And then in the 60s and 70s, there was the environmental movement. They started working on environmental type projects, acquired a certain firm called Henry Steve. That was a respected environmental firm. And then the architecture. HNTB ended up acquiring Kivett and Myers. That was a well-known architectural firm here in Kansas City. They were the ones who did the Arrowhead Stadium and the Kauffman Stadium. They also did KCI Airport. And they did several other projects, and they were quite well known. That HNTB decided to get into architecture, so in 1975 they did that. And then rail and transit, that they did bridges, but they weren't working on rail at that time. So they decided to they acquired a firm called Thomas K. Dyer, or we call it TK Dyer, that they've done a lot of rail work throughout the country. So I'll go back to the Veteran Memorial Bridge again. So here it tells you, it's an old bridge, but to keep it going, we have renovated it twice. So that, and again, it was completed in 1917, that it was still designed by Waddell and Harrington, and later Harrington, Ash, and Howard. And then they did the rehab in 67, 70, that they needed to widen the deck. They had all the issues with the concrete, so they did take care of that. And then it was named to the National Registry, but then they did another rehabilitation in 95 and 96. So there's another bridge engineer that I was able to work with named William Byer. And he was able to, and he was working in the Cleveland office at that time, and apparently he found that they had a huge collection of all these photos of the construction, that it was sort of sitting there. And he, kind of asked, gave permission about, can I publish this into a book? And so this really very thick book that it had showed all the history that when this was built again in 1915, it shows how that bridge was constructed at that time. And then here you see some of the old photos there. And then, again, in '95, okay, this is what the renovation process looked like. That they had to strip everything down to get the deck out and then put that back in. Anything that had to be replaced, they went ahead and did that. So it was a restoration of a historic bridge. And then today, it is still in operation. Cleveland has a requirement that they do try to light the bridges over the Cuyahoga River, and it was interesting that I don't know if any of you have seen the latest Superman movie. Probably not. Yes? Okay. That bridge was featured in that movie because they were using Cleveland as downtown for Metropolis. And my wife and I happened to be there when we visited Cleveland, and they ended up closing off the street, and they put a Daily Planet sign on one of the buildings and all that. And so we had to go watch it because we saw that. And then I saw that in the movie, this is where buildings were toppling over and then they were all collapsing on there. And most bridge engineers will always say, that's not how it works. That in movies, they always do it wrong in terms of how a bridge is supposed to come down. So and again, I'll start talking a little bit about historic HNTB bridges. So there was a resident engineer named Percy Pennybacker. And he worked on the Vicksburg Bridge that I kind of mentioned earlier. And then that's a picture of him as a resident engineer. And I did not know that until I made this presentation at HNTB. And then someone kind of mentioned, oh, you know what? There is a bridge in Austin, Texas that's named after Pennybacker. And he didn't design it, but it's because of what he did that when he was working for the Texas Highway Department, that I think during the war effort, he was interested in welded construction as an alternate to rivets. And so apparently, back then everything was all built in rivets, and he came up with this certain solution of how you end up building bridges better. And so in the end, it's like this saved Texas a lot of money, and they decided to honor him. So there's very few engineers that have a bridge named after them, and so he was one of them. So I mean, there are others. In the Brooklyn Bridge, Roebling has a bridge named after him. The Eads Bridge in St. Louis, that's also named after James Eads. So now what I'll do is I'll just show a certain sampling of how, yes, we built bridges, and then we sometimes have to tear them down in order to build new ones. And so it's not all restoration. So like here, this is a bridge called the Champ Clark Bridge in Louisiana, Missouri. And again, it's also a Mississippi River Bridge. And so like here it shows it completed in 1927. But then we had to replace it later on when it got to be structurally deficient. It was really too narrow. And so that was part of what we did. And then, so I got to go to the dedication of that since I was listed as the bridge architect, I got to sit with the families of Champ Clark that I think my wife was a little annoyed because I just said, oh, I'm not a dignitary, but they said, oh no, if you're a bridge architect, you should sit along with them. So, and again, we've done more Mississippi River bridges. Again, this is the original Greenville Bridge. Again, it was a truss bridge again, and it was completed in 1940, and then we had to replace that with the new Cable Stay Bridge in Greenville. And part of a lot of the bridges that we do is that this bridge was one of the main bridges that was hit by barges a lot. And so that was part of the issue that they had to try to correct. And so we did that with the Cable Stay Bridge by having a wider span. And then over in Delaware, we also did the Delaware Memorial Bridge, the original bridge also, but again, similarly, when they needed to do a parallel structure, we also duplicated the same design, for that. And this is the project. Yeah, this is the Cleveland Innerbelt Bridge that I will later talk about, but again, we did the original bridge here that you see, and it's called the Deck Truss Bridge. And, well, I wasn't supposed to show that because that's something else I would talk about later on. And then here locally, we did the original Broadway Bridge, which was later called the Buck O'Neill Bridge. And so, and again, just recently, we completed the new Buck O'Neill Bridge. We had to take this one down and then build a new one. I will be honest, I was not involved in the aesthetics of this. And the reason why is, first of all, this bridge, it's more of a highway to highway connection. Current Broadway Bridge, you have to come to a stop and then cross over. And I think this used to be an old toll bridge. So on this one, since it was a design build, they wanted to keep it within budget, is one thing. And they didn't want to spend too much on aesthetics, but they did allow a shared use path, that there is now a shared use path for people who are willing to walk on it or cycle towards there. There was a movement to try to keep the old bridge, but unfortunately it was kind of in the way that there was really no better solution for that. And then in Broadway Bridge in Little Rock, there's another Broadway bridge. Again, HNTB did this addition that this used to be an concrete arch bridge. They needed a wider navigational channel, so HNTB came in and created a new arch bridge there. But again, same thing, that had to be replaced because of structural deficiency. And so, and the original plan was kind of like the Buck O'Neill Bridge, that it was not supposed to be a signature bridge. I mean, hopefully no one's from the DOT here. DOTs, they don't care too much about aesthetics, but if the community demands it, then, and if they're willing to pay for it, that's what will happen. So on this bridge, it was supposed to be a standard, I'll call it a standard girder bridge. But then the county judge said, no, we want something that kind of reflects the old arch bridges. And so they ended up requesting me to take a look at this and then see what we could come up with. And we decided to, go with first of all with the arch bridge. And it was, and he wanted it to say, well, why just one? Why not make it 2 arches? So we ended up building 2 arches. And then, good thing I'm not showing this, but this county judge who offered the money, he was proposing to say, well, can you paint this bridge so that the girders are blue and then one arch white and then paint the other arch red? Because he wanted to call it, and he wanted to call it the Veterans Memorial Bridge in honor of the veterans. I tried to talk him out of it, he refused. But in the end, I think I prevailed because someone finally told him that's probably a bad idea. And there was a quote that, and when I did these renderings, and I maybe should have shown it, I thought it was going to be an in-house meeting. I didn't realize it was going to be published everywhere. And so next thing you know, it's like, it's on the news media, it's on the news, papers, whatever, and then people started commenting on it. And then one in the comments, and I think maybe that's, the public input was saying that's a bad idea. And one comment that we all loved is that it reminded them of a last chance county liquor store. So, all right, so I'm going to go and then talk a little bit about the HNTB history, and I don't know how am I doing for time. Okay. So this was a biography from 1965, and at that time that they had like a whole yearbook of all the personnel at HNTB. So this was all back in '65, and I'm kind of showing like these gentlemen here, and then later on in the 75th anniversary that they were still practicing, at that time, and then Harvey Hammond, that he was our CEO, and then so he was featured in that book as well as in the 100th anniversary book. So I'll show some examples, and I call them older bridges because it's not the most recent. So some of the bridges that HNTB has done, this is the Dames Point Bridge in Jacksonville, Florida. That it was like one of the first cable stay bridges. And you'll see a lot of cable stay bridges because that's mostly what a lot of the long span bridges are currently built at a certain span. The suspension bridge, like the Golden Gate, that's for a lot longer spans, but then cable stays has come to a point that, that's gotten to be more efficient as well as, aesthetically pleasing. Here it shows some of the construction of how that bridge was built. And I'll say this is all in Spanish, so I couldn't read it anyway because it was a Spanish publication that featured that. This is the Leonard Zakin Bridge, which you kind of mentioned about. So my role in this was that I was the visualization architect for the Leonard Zakin Bridge. HNTB was doing this as part of the Big Dig project. And I think I told you that I started out, when I started working on computer animation at HNTB, this was the first major bridge that I worked on. So we had to do a 3D model of this bridge. When I look at this now, the graphics is pretty outdated because it was back in I think it was in 95, 96 or so. But then here, this is the 3D model that we did. Here's the completed bridge. And so this has won a lot of awards, as part of that. At that time, it was considered the widest cable stay bridge in the world because it carried 10 lanes of traffic. But the span is pretty short. It's only 742 feet. Yeah. For a cable stay, that could really span longer, but there was a certain need to do that. And then again, it was also featured in this book. And part of the 3D modeling that I did, what happened was that I ended up getting a lot of requests from all these publications from media. Because this was shown at the AASHTO conference, this annual conference, and so book publishers have asked about the images, and so here is the rendering that we did that was featured in that book. And then later on, I was first of all contacted. Okay, this is the Travel Channel, but originally I was contacted by the History Channel that they were doing a documentary on the Big Dig. And they said, oh, we saw this animation, at this conference. Can we get a copy of that? And I go, oh, sure, yeah, we can go ahead and do that. So we did that. And then during the construction, I also got a call from Homeland Security. It was the Secret Service. And they said, oh, I heard that you have a model of Boston in that area. And this is, again, before Google and Maps and all that. And they said, can we get a copy of your model because the Democratic National Convention will be held at the Boston Garden. And so I ended up getting this correspondence, and I said, yes, we have the permission, and I got the letter from them, sealed, and says, oh, we won't use it for anything else. But so it was kind of neat. And then years later, when the bridge was still under construction, the Travel Channel contacted me because they said that they do a 10 best beaches, 10 best resorts, and they said that they wanted to feature the Zakin Bridge as one of the 10 best bridges in the world. And so, we got a lot of famous ones like the Brooklyn Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge, Sydney Harbor Bridge, but the Leonard Zakin was the only one that was not completed. So same thing. They said, hey, I saw that you had an animation of this, can we borrow it? And so, sure enough, we did that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about bridge architecture. That, again, most of the bridges are designed by engineers. Some of them are what I call structural artists. That sometimes they incorporate making sure that the bridges look good. But every so often, they need to get a bridge architect. So I'm going to talk about a couple of bridge engineers who are also architects. And so this gentleman named Santiago Calatrava, he's world famous. That he has done several bridges around Europe, a few here in the U.S. If you go to New York City, over at where the 9/11 memorial is, he ended up building a transit station called the Oculus. That it kind of looks like this, and it's a station that's almost completely white. If you go to Milwaukee, he did the addition to the art museum there, on the riverfront, and that one has got they call it a brise soleil, that is a giant shade for this building that kind of opens up like a bird. So Calatrava is an artist, and he always tries to incorporate that design. So this is one of his famous bridges that he did in Dallas, Texas, called the Margaret Hunt Hill Bridge, again named after someone in the Hunt family of Lamar Hunt fame. So So Calatrava did this design over the Trinity River, and what he did is that instead of the cable stay bridge being the standard stays, he did something that's probably not the most efficient in terms of design for a cable stay, but he ended up reversing where the certain cables go from here to there, and then usually it's the other way around, but he switched it to create like a spirograph type form. You had to have a tower that was a lot taller, but then it looked, gave it a cool factor, and now it became also a symbol for Dallas. There's another bridge engineer and architect named Fred Wattenmiller. Again, he may not be that well known, but then he has been pushing aesthetics on bridges for quite a long time. So this is one of the bridges that he did in Columbus, Ohio, called the Rich Street Bridge. That he was the one that incorporated all these arches that give it some certain rhythm. And then I'll name certain architects that, if you're in the architectural world, you might recognize them and probably not. But Norman Foster is a British architect that was involved in this, what is the tallest cable stay bridge in the world in France. And so every time I watched Tour de France, they will always show this bridge, kind of in the background. Another architect that I respect is a woman named Zaha Hadid. That she was a very talented artist. That she doesn't do anything traditional. I mean, she was more of I don't know how to say it, but she pushes the limits on structural design. But then they are always very innovative. She did a lot of buildings for the London Olympics. But then she has also done bridges. So this is one of the bridges that she has done in Abu Dhabi. And she wanted, instead of this usual standard arches, she wanted to push the envelope to say, what can you do that made it like a waveform? And again, the budget was really huge. But here it shows her some of her sketches. That's something architects do. They love to sketch. So these are some of the sketches that she had on some of her ideas. And then this is another firm named Wilkinson Eyre, another British firm. That they were innovative. That this is a pedestrian bridge that kind of tilts in a 45 degree to allow the ships to go by, so that so that it doesn't have to go all the way up, but it just kind of hinges enough for any boats to come in. And again, that's his captain sketch of this idea. Sir Nicholas Grimshaw is another British architect who recently passed away, and he incorporated the wave design on this transit bridge in the Netherlands. And then this one is the Tilikum Crossing Bridge in Portland, Oregon. It is the only cable stay bridge in the U.S. that is transit and pedestrians only. Cars cannot drive over this. And so HNTB and myself were involved in the preliminary design of this. So these are two of my renderings. These are, again, photo match renderings, but then it's a 3D model that I created into the photo. And then there was an architect of record whose name was Donald McDonald, but he was the one that was responsible for some of the final designs of that. And so he created the book on that. It's almost like showing all his crayon drawings of how he came up with the concepts. And then if you go to the Quad Cities, there's an architect named Miguel Rosales. He's also an MIT alum. And he has worked on a lot of bridges throughout the country. And this is the I-74 bridge that he was responsible for. Oh, and then this guy named Frank Lloyd Wright. Well, hopefully most people know who Frank Lloyd Wright is, because he's like one of the most famous American architects who ever lived. He designed over 40 bridges, but only 2 got built. Yeah, one of them I think is to Falling Water, it's a very short bit, and there's another bridge that he's done. But apparently he had a proposal for a bridge over the San Francisco Bay called the Butterfly Wing Bridge. So here it shows you his drawing of the elevation view and the kind of the plan view. And I didn't know that till later on that if you've seen the movie Die Hard, which some people, with Bruce Willis, the very first one, they were at the Nakamoto Plaza building, and this guy was the villain named Hans Gruber, who was played by Alan Rickman. And apparently, I did not know that till later on, this was the model of Frank Lloyd Wright's bridge that was used in that movie. Apparently, they contacted Taliesin to say, hey, can we borrow your model of Frank Lloyd Wright's bridge for use in this movie? And so that's what they used it there for. Okay, I'm going to try to move a little bit faster. In HNTB, like we've always had a bridge architect on staff, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the history. This was a gentleman named Don Stevens that he started at HNTB in '57, and he worked with Bergendorf, who was the B in the HNTB, and he was the first bridge architect. And when I say bridge architect, this is someone that works solely in the bridge group, doesn't do buildings, he works directly with the bridge engineers on the aesthetics. So, and I think I probably skipped it, but so this is what I call the three generations of bridge architects. So Don Stevens was practicing from the 50s to the 80s. Greg DeMond, who I kind of mentioned before, he worked from the 70s to the 2010s, and I've worked from the 1990s to the present. So Don Stevens, again, this is some of his concepts on a bridge that he would come up with all these different ideas and concepts. That's all hand sketched to develop certain ideas of that. And so this is the completed bridge of the Althea Bridge. And then Greg DeMond, again, he worked under Don. Before that, he was, again, the artist that did that hand painting, over that photograph. So I kind of mentioned about the Natchez Bridge, but he also did watercolors. But then if you go to the Wichita area, he was also the bridge architect for the Wichita Pedestrian Bridge. It's a really nice two parallel cable-stayed bridges. But here you see his hand sketches. These are the concepts that he had of what the towers would look like, how the base would look like, what the handrails would look like. And this was in a charrette that they meet with the clients to come up with some ideas. And this is where the architect comes in and starts hand drawing things really quickly. He also worked on the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, not the one that fell, if you know about that one. This was, so you may have heard of Galloping Gertie, that in most science classes, that was a bridge that when the winds really hit, it started waving and then it crashed down. And then this was what they ended up building. HNTB was asked to do an addition to it to make another parallel structure, but then it was going to be a different type of suspension bridge. And so Greg has, had several ideas of what the towers would look like in order to respect the older bridges. He ended up doing a cross bracing of that. So then here is myself. My hair was a little darker back then. But again, I've worked with Greg on that, and here was when and this is something I enjoy, that I like to go to schools and do presentations or charrettes to tell them what HNTB does and what bridge architecture is. So I kind of mentioned about the Zakin Bridge before. If you go to St. Louis, this is the Stan Musial Veterans Memorial Bridge, or what's called the I-70 Bridge. Again, I worked on that, did the 3D modeling of that, did also the aesthetic lighting, for that. And they had to do the opening in February, so there was some ice and snow all along there, so we kind of survived. We also did the Golden Gate Bridge seismic retrofit. That after all the earthquakes that came in, HNTB was asked to retrofit, make it so that it'll be, I'll say, earthquake proof. We had to show an animation to show the sequencing of how you would end up building the deck. That apparently you cannot shut the bridge down completely. It's like they can only work at a certain time at night, when they would close off certain traffic in order to replace the deck, and then they had to reopen it the next day and for all the commuters. So we ended up working on that. I also worked on what they have currently built, which is called the SDS, which stands for Suicide Deterrent System. That the Golden Gate and several bridges were known for people committing suicide. And so what they have done is that they have implemented a net underneath the deck. So that what they're hoping to do is that they'll kind of deter, hopefully, people trying to jump off won't be able to go straight down, that the net will kind of catch them until people call for help. I had to show what's called the traveler, that they have to do have inspections of bridges, and so there's a traveler system that they had to incorporate in there that goes up and down and checks on the bridges. And then in Louisiana, in New Orleans, we did the addition to this Huey P. Long Bridge, which I don't think this animation will probably pay, but we had to show how we would add on to the existing bridge. Now back on the Tilikum Crossing, okay, so these are some of the, again, hand sketches. You know, we always start out with hand sketches before we develop an idea for that. And again, this is showing the renderings that I ended up working on for that project. And this is again under construction and lit up. So I'm going to talk about a little case study. And again, I've already showed you the bridge already, but this is the Interbelt Bridge in Cleveland, Ohio. And the same thing, HNTB did the original bridge. I think I told you it was a deck truss bridge. But then again, that was structurally deficient that they had to replace it. And a lot of the bridges that needed to be replaced, part of that is when they discovered some of the issues with design. I think the I-35 West Bridge in Minnesota, that's the one that was kind of overloaded. There was a gusset plate issue, and then so it kind of fell. And so a lot of the bridges that were under that design, they thought that they had to replace that. So this was rather interesting because, again, it was a design build project, meaning you had to team up with a contractor in order to go after the job and win it. And usually, again, you saw that I do a lot of renderings, but on this project, they requested that each team had to submit 3 renderings. One of them had to be a night shot. It was going to be a public survey, and that they would determine what they liked, what they didn't like, or so. And apparently, they said that was 5 bonus points for the aesthetics. And they had to do that a month before their selection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 3 teams, and again, they were not told what was what team. So this is Team C, that they showed their 2 renderings that showed what the bridge would look like. Showed a night shot of that. This is Team B, and again, same thing. And the requirements is that it had to be a steel girder bridge, is what it was. They also said that from the piers, the girders had to be curved out. You can't have a straight girder, so that was part of that. And then Team C, or Team A, which I think I've already shown you that. So, but again, these were my renderings of this project. And here's what the scoring came into. That Team B, the first team, they only got 1 point. Some of the comments that they said was there's no significant strengths. The public survey, they only got 37%. So, it didn't grade that well. Team C was the middle one that had the arch, and they only got 2.5 points. And then the Walsh team, which is also part of HNTB, we ended up getting 5 points. So, it was part of that reason that we got selected on the aesthetic points, but then of course on the team you also have to come up with a price, and I think our structural team also came up with a price that was competitive. I'll say this first team, they dropped out. As soon as the public survey came out, they just dropped out of the whole project. And so here's what the completed bridge looked like. Again, what we did was that we did this curve off of the piers, which was a requirement. This was, however, called an alternate technical concept, that we said, well, we're not really following the rules. Can we deviate from it as long as it's accepted? And they said, well, yeah, we want you to be innovative. And so we came up with this delta girder idea. And the idea was that these girders were getting so deep that they said, well, if we made it out of smaller pieces, it would be easier to transport. And at the same time, the aesthetics, that it allowed us to try to do some aesthetic lighting. And so this was a view last 4th of July in Cleveland, that they had the lights on. I was there at 4 in the morning, shining down, taking a photo of that, and I see the light changing. Or so. So here are some of the HNTB bridges. Again, we don't do only one type of bridge, we do several. So if you go to Iowa City, this is the Park Road Bridge in Iowa City, Iowa. And then if you go to Omaha, we did the Bob Carey Pedestrian Bridge. Now this is a cable stay bridge that goes over the Missouri River. It's in a S-shaped pipe, and then we just recently completed the addition, another connection to it that connects to the downtown area. We do bascule bridges. This is in South Park in Seattle that replaced an existing pump. And then the walk bridge, this is similar to the ASB bridge. It is a railroad bridge that carries 4 tracks. And I was involved in it because the city demanded aesthetics, is what it was. And a vertical lift bridge is kind of like an elevator that it kind of goes up, and they've got machinery on top to lift the thing up. At some point, I think originally we wanted to do a bascule bridge, but I think the problem is that railroads do not like to shut down. They always want to keep the tracks running. And so this method allowed them to build over the existing tracks and then do a switch over like over a weekend. So it carries 4 tracks. What happened is that the old bridge was an old swing span bridge that got stuck. It was over 130 some years old, so that every so often when the bridge is in an open position and then the trains can't go through it because it can't move, then you have all these commuters to New York that couldn't get there. So, again, we also do these concrete girder bridges. This is a Jeremiah Bridge in Omaha. And then we also did, again, a lot of rail bridges. This is the Honolulu rail system. And then a steel arch bridge. That was in Massachusetts and then in West Virginia. We also do some project management work. And this is the what we used to call the Tappan Zee Bridge, and then they named it the Governor Mario Cuomo Bridge. Then the Gerald Desmond Bridge in Long Beach, California. And then this is again the K Bridge, we call it the Kosciuszko Bridge. This is the first cable stayed road bridge in New York City. I ended up working on the aesthetic lighting of that. And then in Dallas, again, we have built this pedestrian bridge over this interstate. That again, it's again an S-shaped type ped bridge that connects the 2 of the trails. If you go to Chicago, there's this lakefront trail flyover that connects to the Navy Pier. And this design, it's almost like a roller coaster. Rather than your traditional straight ones, it's using kind of a pipe system that will follow along the whole trail. And if you go to Washington, D.C., we were also the project managers for the Frederick Douglass Bridge. And then I mentioned about historic preservation stuff. This is the 3rd Avenue Bridge in Minnesota that we have also completed. And then finally in Los Angeles, this is the Sixth Street Bridge replacement. This has been featured in a lot of commercials lately. It replaced a bridge that was really well known, called the Sixth Street Bridge. If you're a fan of Grease, that's where they held the race underneath it. If you see Terminator, so then this is going over the LA River, but the bridge that they replaced, even though it was built in the 50s and there were several other bridges, that one had what's called a silica-alkali reaction, that the concrete mix was not that good. It was almost like cancer. So we ended up having to replace it. And we came up with this idea with a local architect named Michael Malson, that rather than just one arch over a river, we just spanned the whole entire thing and called it a ribbon of light. Okay, so finally, again, this is a little bit about our bridge practice here. And then and then this is our current leader named Scott Rude, who had a major experience. And I think that's it. I have 3 minutes to spare. Any questions? Yeah.
I couldn't help but notice the bridge in Louisiana, Missouri. Looks quite similar to the Causeway Bridge over Lake Pontchartrain.
Probably. Yeah.
What's the span? I mean, Lake Pontchartrain's like 23 miles.
Well, yeah, right. No, the Mississippi River is not as wide as the Lake Pontchartrain Bridge. I mean, that one you're talking, yeah, it's a whole long corridor, that's going over that area. It is a similar type bridge, but I wouldn't say, I mean, the Champ Clark Bridge, it's only got maybe like 5 spans that we just needed to clear for that. We did a bridge similar to Lake Pontchartrain which is a US 90 bridge in Bay St. Louis. That was a bridge that I think after Katrina hit, again, that bridge was out of commission, and so we had to go in there and try to rebuild that.
How deep do you normally go, like in Pontchartrain, before you find a rock that you can build those piers on?
Well, yeah.
I asked because
Mhm.
one of the owners of the died of bends
Yeah.
in the Mississippi River.
Mhm.
Well, it's not that deep.
Well, it's not that, it really depends on how far you go down. And then what it is, no, you don't go all the way down, because usually what they have to do is not the footings, it's the piles. That sometimes you have to drive piles all the way down to a solid rock or so, or the bedrock. So, I mean, a good example is like on the Golden Gate Bridge. Like where they had set the piers, it's because of where can they find bedrock to get down there. And so that's something that they have to consider. That if they moved it one over, it would have been deeper. So that's what always kind of determines, where you end up placing where the piers are. Yes.
I don't know if I should ask this, but how are the bridges doing in Kansas City? I keep hearing these stories about there's not a lot of bridges in great shape.
Yeah.
Are we getting there, or how's it doing?
No, that is a constant factor that happens. I think when the bridge collapsed in Minnesota, the I-35 West Bridge, that's when all the states started looking at and these are all roadway bridges all over the state. So they had MoDOT had a program called Safe and Sound that they ended up rehabbing or replacing over 600 bridges at that time. So that's something that they evaluate each bridge, see what the condition is, what can be done, what is the best method to do that. So that's something, and unfortunately, it always seems like, okay, after all the years come by, you always have to wait for a disaster to then finally do it. It's something about maintenance, that bridges, won't last forever unless you maintain them. And I think that's the unfortunate thing, is that sometimes they think, we don't need any maintenance until there's some sort of problem with it. Yes?
Yeah, you referred to a cable stayed
Yes.
bridge. That's a term I don't know. What is a cable stayed bridge as opposed to other kinds of bridges?
Well, let's see if I could. Okay, I mean, so this is a cable stay bridge. Okay, and what it is, in fact, you should probably talk to the engineer back there to probably talk more about that. So, no, but a cable stay bridge, I mean, that's, again, for certain long span bridges, that you can't have piers along there, you gotta span a certain distance. So it's like, 800 to like 1,500, span that you could do a cable stay bridge. That's gotten to be a lot more efficient, because what it is, if you look at the Bond Bridge, which was, it replaced an old, a Paseo Bridge, that's a cable stay bridge. So you've got a tower that's there, but then you've got the cables that are acting to support the deck of that.
Okay, so all of the bridges that have towers and have
Yeah.
cables,
Well, there's string cables. So I got the answer from Jesse's former
Sam?
colleague. No,
No?
Steve Hay.
Oh, yes.
And I said, because I'm not a bridge engineer, I said, what's the deal with these cable stay bridges? And he said, well, Deb, it's easy. They could design a suspension bridge like the Golden Gate or the Brooklyn, right, where there's a curve. They could design that by hand calculations. With the cable stay bridges, each cable is its own equation, and they had to wait for modern computing because it's that many simultaneous equations. So that's the geeky answer.
Well, yeah. Yeah, and so part of, and what she was saying is that, again, each of these cables are supporting that deck, is really what, what it comes down to. But unlike a suspension bridge, which is, what you see on the Golden Gate Bridge, they've got a suspended cable between the towers, and then you've got hangers going vertically down. And so it's really whereas with this one, all of these loads are going straight to the tower to hold up that deck. And as you mentioned, now they're using computers to really calculate exactly what you need to do to hold that weight. So, and you know, aesthetically, I mean, that's something that you know, that it does give a nice look to it, but it's not, you know, pretty pictures. You know, there's a lot of engineering about how much they have to do, how far can they span it in order to get there. Yes?
I have a question then about temperature.
Mm-hmm.
The temperature would make a big difference in the length of those spans, right? When it gets hot, when it gets cold,
Yes.
they expand and contract.
Yeah, again, I'm not the engineer for that, so, no, but that's something that, you know, each of the cables, you know, they are designed accordingly. You know, they allow for expansion or contraction or so. I don't know if heat is really the major factor. I think it's wind. You know, I think, you know, I mean, in terms of bridges, you know, we have to design for dead loads, live loads. You know, then when you get to the earthquake, you know, there's also seismic that you have to deal with. In terms of temperature, I think one of the issues, and again, back to that Interbelt Bridge in Cleveland, they made a decree that they didn't want any arches above the deck, or, you know, so that there was one idea that showed a small arch over the deck, but apparently that kind of violated the design concept.
So a long span
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't make any difference to a short span as far as the variation in length
Well,
with temperature.
Well, I don't know, again, with the temperature, I think it's really more what kind of forces are really
Okay.
you know, holding that in. I mean, it is designed for extreme temperatures or so. I mean, but what I was going to say is that in Cleveland, they had an issue with a bridge in Toledo called the Veterans Glassway Bridge that the bridge engineer decided that aesthetically they wanted to cover the cables, you know, because usually there is a covering to the cable. You know, it's not just one cable; it's really several strands, you know, that are in there. And he decided to cover it up with stainless steel, like brushed stainless steel. Unfortunately, what happened is that in the wintertime, you get ice that may accumulate onto that, and it started crashing down onto their cars, so that they had to shut the bridge down or so. In Canada, I know that what they do is either they get a helicopter out there to blow off all the snow or ice, or they'll have some sort of a ring that they put on there to kind of like push it down and put out just to scrape all the snow and ice. Yes?
You talked about the Tacoma Narrows Bridge
Yes. Mm-hmm.
that fell down and the new one which went up.
Yes.
What sort of changes in the bridge design did they have to make in order to build the second one?
Well, I think the major part with the first one is that they didn't allow enough stiffness on the deck. And they also, you know, and I think there was a push about how, they wanted to make structures light or make it float or so. And so I think, and I think part of the problem with in the old Tacoma Narrows is first of all, it was not that wide, is one thing. You know, it was only really a 2-lane road, so it wasn't wide enough. Secondly, it wasn't deep enough. They were trying to make it so that certain shallow girders or so. And so there was a lot of that issue. And then again, the wind forces they didn't really account for. So I think after the Tacoma Narrows, a lot of it is they had to try to work on making sure that the deck itself is stiff enough. But then how do you do it so that you kind of balance it, you know, from aesthetics to something that's structural? You know, so there is a balance that, and I'll say this, every engineer, bridge engineer, you know, I have a lot of respect for because they design stuff to make sure that it works. Architects, you know, again, and I'm fortunate that I work in the bridge group because you get certain architects who try to design a bridge that don't have that experience, and they come up with some wild ideas, and they could build it. You know, they can build it, but then it may not follow the traditional, you know, structural design, or you know, it'll look more expensive. So there's a balance that you have to do the aesthetics of a bridge. And a lot of the earlier bridge designers, you know, they incorporated aesthetics. Well, like for instance, on the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, you know, there's a lot of aesthetics that is involved in there, because at that time it was 1870s or so. They had the Gothic towers holding that up, but then the cables themselves, in terms of the size of that, cables are about this small, but they had so many of them. So I think it's part of that engineering that they have to deal with. Yes.
I'm really curious. My brother lives in San Francisco, and when you say you're retrofit or whatever the Golden Gate Bridge against earthquakes,
Yes.
can you guarantee that? What do you do to make certain that it can withstand an earthquake? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
I'm sure it will.
Well, right. Yeah. No, I think it's something that with how earthquakes react and act, that you have to take a look at what needs to be done. So, when the Golden Gate Bridge was built, it's like, okay, if they have a large earthquake coming in, if we didn't do anything, it will collapse. Or so. So like what we had to do, we didn't replace everything, but there are certain areas that we, had to kind of reinforce. I think where the towers are and where the cables come in, they had to change that anchorage at the top so that I think it's now a saddle that goes through that. There are certain things that they had to do. There's some reinforcing that they had to do on the deck that they ended up replacing, and they had to replace all the rivets. In fact, I should have brought that. I had the actual rivet from the Golden Gate that the resident engineer just said, "Hey, you want to come? You want that? Here, take it." So, but they were all replaced with nuts that kind of looked like rivets or so. And a good example is that you asked about earthquakes. Let's see. So this is a Sixth Street Bridge in LA. Over here, you'll see that the piers are not connected completely to the base of that pier. And because this is all sitting on bearings. So the whole bridge on the top is, they've got the certain bearings that go in both directions so that if an earthquake hits, it's not going to snap off. It will just sort of move or swing in that manner. Now, it all depends on the magnitude of the earthquake. If it's a really huge one, there's probably nothing we could do, but we want to ensure that it doesn't totally collapse just from like one single area failure. Yes?
And just one last thing, I'll shut up.
No, it's okay.
When I went to Cincinnati a few years ago, which I hadn't been to in 40 years, I stayed in Covington, Kentucky, which is right across. And there was the Roebling Bridge.
Yeah.
A bridge that he built, and they did a wonderful job of statue of him and a thing about the bridge. And it was just amazing to know that here was this bridge by Roebling in Covington, Kentucky, and Cincinnati, and they honor it, and it's there. It's wonderful.
And what's interesting is that the Roebling family, again, they were known for the Brooklyn Bridge and all the famous other bridges, but but after that, they didn't really just work on total bridges. They worked on cables. Roebling was the one that provided the cables for the Golden Gate Bridge. So the family, I think, did finally shut their business down in the 50s or so. But there is a long history about how they were the ones who were responsible for a lot of the cables on the bridges. And if you ever get to someplace in New Jersey, there is a Roebling Museum that when I presented last month at the New York City Bridge Conference, there was someone there that talked about the museum and says, please come in.
But it was his wife who really did a lot of it.
That's
because
correct.
He was sick, right?
Yeah. And the story
she's now getting the credit that she deserves.
I think in the engineering world, the story, and I don't know if you know the story about the Brooklyn Bridge, that it was John Roebling was the main engineer, but then he fell ill, I think, during the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. His son Washington had to take over, but then Washington also got ill, I think, from the bends. And so it was his wife, Emily, that basically became the resident engineer. That her husband was really bedridden, and she's the one that got his instructions and went to the job site And she did that for 10 years. So she was really considered the first woman engineer in that practice. And again, at that time, yes, you did go to school for learning engineering and all that, but then a lot of them are self-made. Like James Eads of St. Louis, of the Eads Bridge, that's the only bridge that he built. He did only one bridge because he was more known for doing all the work on the Mississippi for all the barge traffic and all that. And so he was really known for that, but he came up with that, and that was like one of the first steel bridges that was built even before the Brooklyn Bridge.
Thank you, I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. Yes?
Yeah, you said that quite a few of the bridge firms also build sports arenas and
Yes.
stuff
Well,
like that.
no.
Do you have any inside information as to what the chiefs of all those?
Well, no. Again, Kansas City. We have a lot of sports architectural firms. I mean, HNTB again was founded by Kivett and Myers, but from that, HOK created the sports group. A firm called Ellerby Beckett created a sports group. But now today, if I have to tell you a whole story, that HOK Sports became Populous, and then Populous then broke away from HOK, and then HOK wasn't supposed to do sports architecture, but now they've come back. So now you've got two firms that kind of started out with HOK Sports. HNTB, I mean, we also do sports architecture. Another firm called Ellery Beckett, they've been bought out by so many firms, and now they're part of, I think, called AECOM. So certain firms, again, they maybe stick only on architecture. Some of them will do engineering, and some of them will combine. Like AECOM, for example, they've since they have an architectural department, they also do bridges, and so they are multidisciplinary also.
I think
Anything
I want
else?
to thank you for